In the summer of 1943, the skies over Europe were shifting in ways many commanders on the ground could not yet fully appreciate. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the airspace over the continent, beating back any challenge to German control and maintaining superiority with a mixture of tactical innovation, skillful pilots, and bold leadership. But beneath the surface of confidence, cracks had begun to appear. The Allied bombing campaign was intensifying in scale, frequency, and ambition. But beneath the surface of confidence, cracks had begun to appear. The Allied bombing campaign was intensifying in scale, frequency, and ambition. American heavy bombers were probing deeper into German-held territory than ever before, striking at factories, rail lines, fuel depots, and industrial hubs essential for sustaining the German war machine. The Luftwaffe, which once flew with an aura of invincibility, was under strain, stretched thin across multiple fronts. But beneath the surface of confidence, cracks had begun to appear. The Allied bombing campaign was intensifying in scale, frequency, and ambition. American heavy bombers were probing deeper into German-held territory than ever before, striking at factories, rail lines, fuel depots, and industrial hubs essential for sustaining the German war machine. The Luftwaffe, which once flew with an aura of invincibility, was under strain, stretched thin across multiple fronts. And in this critical moment, a conflict of perception between those who understood the changing reality of the air war and those still clinging to outdated assumptions would determine the fate of German defenses. At the center of this story stood Adolf Galland, one of the most respected fighter aces of the Luftwaffe. With over 100 aerial victories and a reputation for blunt honesty, Galland had risen to the position of General der Jagdflieger, the inspector of fighters. His task was simple in theory but enormously difficult in practice to ensure that German fighter units were trained, equipped, and tactically prepared to defend the Reich from the ever-growing Allied air assault. Galland understood better than most that the future of the air war would not be won by bravado or belief in past triumphs. It required adaptation, realism, and an unflinching willingness to see the dangers ahead. And the danger he saw coming in August 1943 was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. For months, American intelligence and industrial power had converged on a singular goal: develop fighter escorts with the range to accompany heavy bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany. Until this moment, American bombers, particularly the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-2 for Liberator, had been forced to rely on their own defensive armament once they crossed beyond the protective escort range of P-47s and Spitfires. German pilots called this region the fighter's playground. The deeper the bombers flew into Europe, the fewer escorts they had. And when the escorts turned back due to fuel limits, the German fighters struck with precision and deadly coordination. This reality had shaped Luftwaffe strategy. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force, firmly believed that American fighters would never be able to escort bombers into the heart of Germany. To him, the laws of physics and engineering placed hard limits on Allied reach. Göring assumed that as long as German interceptors waited for the escorts to turn back, the bombers would remain vulnerable. But Galland was beginning to see clearer signs that this assumption was dangerously outdated. Throughout early and mid-1943, Luftwaffe pilots started reporting unusual encounters. American Lockheed P-38 Lightning sleek, twin-engine fighters capable of high altitude and impressive speed were appearing farther from the coasts, in places previously considered beyond their combat radius. The P-38 had long been respected for its versatility, but its range had supposedly limited it to operations over the Mediterranean, the United Kingdom, and northern France. Yet pilots were now seeing them deep over the Low Countries, escorting bombers longer than before. Something had changed, but only a few commanders realized how important that change was. Adolf Galland was one of them. He had studied the reports with concern. His fighter groups, already depleted by constant combat and fuel shortages, were struggling to counter bomber formations that seemed increasingly difficult to disrupt. The presence of long-range P-38s hinted at an evolution in Allied strategy, one that, if ignored, could place Germany's industrial heartland in mortal danger. Galland gathered the intelligence, summaries, pilot accounts, and technical analyses available. Every line of evidence pointed toward a single conclusion: the Americans were extending their fighter range, and soon their bombers would no longer be exposed deep inside Europe. In August 1943, Galland took this warning directly to Hermann Göring. The meeting was tense even before it began. By this point in the war, Galland's relationship with Göring had become strained. Galland was a fighter pilot who trusted frontline experience over political rhetoric. Göring, once a decorated ace in the First World War, had become increasingly disconnected from operational reality. He preferred optimistic reports over unwelcome truths. The Luftwaffe leadership environment had grown toxic, with criticism often interpreted as disloyalty. Galland entered the briefing room with the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. If his warning was dismissed, Germany would face a crisis for which the Luftwaffe was not prepared. He laid out the situation clearly. American long-range fighters were escorting bombers deeper than before. Their endurance was improving, tactics were evolving. And the P-38 Lightning posed a particular danger because its twin engines made it more survivable over long distances and at high altitude. Galland warned that if Germany did not respond by increasing fighter strength, improving radar coordination, and preparing for deep penetration escorts, the bomber offensive would soon reach a decisive tipping point. He expected resistance, but not the outright rejection he received. As Galland explained the sightings of P-38s and the implications for the future of German air defense, Göring became visibly agitated. Interrupting Galland mid-sentence, Göring dismissed the notion outright. He insisted that long-range fighter escorts were technically impossible and that the Americans could not have solved the fuel and performance limitations that plagued such aircraft. Göring waved off the pilot reports as exaggerations or misidentifications in his view. Galland was being alarmist. Then Göring said the words that would echo through Luftwaffe history. "Impossible, you are mistaken, long-range P-38s do not exist." The silence that followed was heavy. Galland, frustrated but still respectful, reaffirmed that the reports were accurate. He emphasized that the Luftwaffe could not base its defense strategy on assumptions. Göring refused to budge. He believed in his own conclusions, not in the hard evidence presented by his inspector of fighters. To admit that the Americans were solving the range problem would require rethinking the entire defensive doctrine, and Göring was unwilling to do so. The meeting ended without action. Galland walked out knowing that the Luftwaffe was heading toward disaster. In the weeks that followed, Galland's warnings proved prophetic. The Americans continued refining drop tanks, fuel management, and escort strategies. P-38s and later the P-47s, equipped with extended-range tanks, pushed deeper into Europe, covering bombers longer and reacting faster to German interceptor attacks. Luftwaffe losses began accelerating as pilots entered fights where escorts could intervene at unexpected distances. Many veteran German pilots found themselves outmaneuvered and outnumbered in airspaces where they once held confident advantage. The Battle of Schweinfurt-Regensburg in August 1943 further demonstrated the shifting reality. Although the Americans suffered severe losses during this raid due to limited escort range, analysts on both sides recognized something significant. If the Americans ever fielded true long-range escorts, the entire German defensive strategy would collapse. And while the Luftwaffe leadership debated the issue, American engineers and tacticians quietly completed the breakthrough Göring insisted was impossible. By late 1943, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang with a powerful Merlin engine, excellent high-altitude performance, and extraordinary range sealed Germany's fate. With drop tanks fitted, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany, engage interceptors, and return safely to England. It was the exact development Galland had warned about only months earlier. And when the Mustangs appeared in force in early 1944, the effect was devastating. The Luftwaffe lost pilots faster than they could be replaced. Training programs were shortened dramatically. Fuel shortages worsened. Aircraft production struggled to keep pace with losses. In hindsight, many historians looked back at that August 1943 moment as a turning point, not because Göring could have stopped the arrival of long-range escorts, but because Germany failed to prepare for them. Had they acknowledged the threat earlier, they might have deployed defensive strategies more effectively, invested in countermeasures, or conserved pilots and resources more carefully. Instead, Göring's refusal to accept reality created a dangerous blind spot. Galland, observing the collapse from within, later described his frustration. He believed that if leadership had listened, the Luftwaffe could have adapted, at least partially repositioning fighter squadrons, improving dispersal tactics, and preparing assault waves to disrupt escort fighters earlier in their approach. But because Göring dismissed the possibility, the Luftwaffe remained locked into a strategy predicated on outdated assumptions. When the American escorts finally materialized at full strength, German defenses were caught unprepared. Unprepared, the impact was so severe that by early 1944, Galland privately believed the air war over Germany was lost. Yet even after Göring's dismissal of the long-range P-38 threat was proven wrong, the political atmosphere inside Luftwaffe headquarters made it nearly impossible for subordinates to challenge him openly. Many officers feared that contrad. The Reichsmarschall would be interpreted as defeatism or disloyalty. Galland himself continued to clash with Göring in later months over fighter allocation, bomber strategy, and the development of new aircraft such as the Me-160 jet fighter. These disputes highlighted a pattern. Galland approached problems with practical realism, while Göring clung to optimism and political image. The August 1943 warning about the P-38 Lightnings is often cited as a classic example of how arrogance and denial can undermine military decision-making. Göring's refusal to accept evidence reflected a broader collapse in Luftwaffe leadership, amplified by overconfidence and a lack of technical understanding. It also demonstrated the dangerous disconnect between frontline pilots who risked their lives daily and the high command, which increasingly operated in a world of filtered reports and wishful thinking. Galland himself later wrote about the meeting, expressing both disbelief and sadness at how his warning was dismissed. He had no desire to embarrass Göring. His only goal was to prepare the Luftwaffe for the evolving threat. The sight of P-38s deep over German territory should have been a wake-up call. Instead, Göring waved it away as an impossibility, trapping his air force in a dangerous illusion. As the Allied bombing offensive intensified in late 1943 and early 1944, the Luftwaffe's situation deteriorated dramatically. German fighter units lacked fuel, spare parts, and experienced pilots. New aircraft designs, such as the Focke-Wulf 190D and Messerschmitt 109G variants, offered incremental improvements but could not compensate for the overwhelming Allied numerical advantage. Meanwhile, American escort fighters developed sophisticated tactics, dive-and-zoom attacks, flexible escort zones, and aggressive interception of German fighters before they reached the bomber formations. By mid-1944, the skies over Europe belonged almost entirely to the Allies. Looking back, the seeds of this crisis were planted long before the first Mustangs crossed into Germany. They were laid in decisions like Göring's disbelief in August 1943, when a critical warning from one of his most qualified officers was brushed aside. By mid-1944, the skies over Europe belonged almost entirely to the Allies. Looking back, the seeds of this crisis were planted long before the first Mustangs crossed into Germany. They were laid in decisions like Göring's disbelief in August 1943, when a critical warning from one of his most qualified officers was brushed aside. The consequences of that disbelief rippled across the subsequent months, shaping the fate of the air war and hastening the collapse of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. The long-range P-38s that German pilots saw in the summer of 1943 were not illusions. They were the early signs of a strategic transformation. And when Galland tried to sound the alarm, he encountered a leadership unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths. The war in the air was changing rapidly, but the minds in charge of defending Germany were not. Today, scholars and military analysts often point to this episode as a lesson in the dangers of underestimating one's enemy and ignoring frontline intelligence. Wars are rarely lost by lack of courage. They are often lost by lack of understanding. Galland understood the threat. Göring rejected it, and in that moment of denial, a cascade of consequences began, consequences that would help seal the fate of the Luftwaffe and alter the direction of the war. In the end, history would remember the exchange between Galland and Göring not just as a disagreement, but as a symbol of a larger systemic failure. It reflected the widening gulf between operational reality and leadership fantasy. It demonstrated how technological evolution, when paired with industrial power and strategic determination, could overturn old assumptions in an instant. And it showed that sometimes the greatest danger lies not in the enemy's strength, but in the refusal to believe that the enemy is growing stronger. The skies over Europe in 1943 were not static, and Galland's warnings were a glimpse into a rapidly shifting future. The P-38 Lightnings, with their twin-boom silhouette and deep reach, were the harbingers of the long-range escort era, an era that would culminate in Allied air superiority so overwhelming that the Luftwaffe, once feared across the continent, could no longer effectively defend its own homeland. As the war moved toward its final years, Galland's frustration deepened. He continued to challenge Göring's unrealistic expectations, particularly regarding the deployment of the Me-160 jet fighters. He believed they should be used as interceptors, not as bombers, a recommendation Göring rejected, with similarly disastrous consequences. Over and over, German pilots found themselves fighting a war defined by decisions made far above them, decisions shaped more by political considerations than military necessity. Yet despite these failures, Galland's legacy endures as one of clarity, competence, and foresight. He stood among the few who could see the unfolding truth in 1943, even when those above him refused to listen. His attempt to warn Göring about long-range P-38s was not an act of rebellion, but an act of response. Ability, a leader trying to protect the men under his command and prepare his country's defenses for the realities of modern aerial warfare. Göring's response, dismissing the warning as impossible, reveals the dangerous consequences of leadership detached from reality. It was a moment that encapsulated a broader failure, a failure that would contribute to the Luftwaffe's rapid decline and the Allied dominance of the skies.